My name is Ray O'Keefe. I'm an alcoholic. And I've been in Alcoholics Anonymous a long time. And you can tell by looking at me, I've been somewhere for a long time. It is very nice to be again in Santa Barbara. I've met a lot of people here in Alcoholics Anonymous that I've known before this weekend, and I've also met a great many of the Al-Anon ladies that follow Sue around. And I was surprised that there'd be so many Al-Anons here this evening. I thought they would all be attending another very important meeting of the Al-Anon family groups, which is being held nearby in the mother church of all Al-Anon, the Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Revenge. Only kidding, Sue, only kidding. Let me tell you about my drinking. I don't want you to miss any of this. It's a thrill a minute. I grew up in one of the neighborhoods in New York City, and my neighborhood was rough, and it was tough, and it was Irish. And this may not occur to you here in Santa Barbara, but they drank in that neighborhood. You would actually see people on the street under the influence of alcohol. This is very disturbing to a young child from a dysfunctional family. And if you looked at where I lived, you'd see a little drinking. My mother, the widow O'Keefe, was known to take a drink from time to time. And when the pressure got on, Kitty would go for the light wines and the spirits, and something would fly, usually one of the children. My brother Billy, on the other hand, was a very bad drinker, and in a neighborhood of Irish drunks, Billy O'Keefe stood out. So when I showed up at the local place and ordered up whatever it was they were serving 14-year-olds that afternoon, no one paid any attention to me. It was just another O'Keefe coming through the system. I do not recall exactly what it was they served me. I suspect it was a beer. That was the neighborhood drink. But whatever it was, I liked it. I liked everything about it. I liked the way it looked. And I liked the way it smelled. I liked the way it tastes. I liked what it did for my head. I liked the noise and the smoke and the confusion. I liked the fistfights and the Irish music. I liked the bullshit. That's what I really liked. And I went after it for the next many years. I was going through the parochial school system, in a manner of speaking, and I got into all of the difficulties you might imagine a young man would get into trying to go through the Catholic school system drunk. I was thrown out of high school a number of times. I held a neighborhood record for being thrown out of high school, a record previously established by my brother Billy. When I was finished with high school, or more properly, when they were finished with me, because someone made a mistake, I think, somewhere, I got an opportunity to go to college. So I went off to the state of Vermont to go to college. And this was a great culture shock. There were no bars in that state, just restaurants. And these people sat around at tables, and they drank beer out of bottles. And they sang college songs, and they wore white shoes in the wintertime. Being a man of no particular moral fiber, I got a pair of white shoes. I learned the words to some of those dopey songs, and I was very collegiate. World War II was just about over, and it seemed like a relatively safe bet. So one day I got a haircut and joined the Navy. And I ended up on a minesweeper up in San Francisco. And I hate to be indelicate at such a nice gathering, but I have to tell you, I had a lot of trouble with my kidneys when I drank. And in the Navy, we slept 3 to a tier. Will you give me a break here, Charlie, for Christ's sake? You think this is easy? Wait a while. And a new man slept on top. And I came back from my first liberty in San Francisco with all the beer in me I could buy, and I went to sleep. And I had one of these attacks. And I got to meet the fellow that slept below me. I suppose he thought he would be wet sometime in his naval career. It just not had occurred to him that it would happen while he was sleeping. I was immediately transferred to a lower bunk. The rest of my naval career was just as distinguished, and I returned home some years later to the neighborhood unhonored, undecorated, and unloved. And everything was under control in the neighborhood. The widow was out in the weeds somewhere. My brother Billy was missing without permission from the New York City Police Department. Billy had invited a citizen off a 5-story roof, and the citizen had bounced and lived to identify the Irish cop. So Billy came out west and went back into the Marine Corps for a more peaceful type of life. And the government was paying veterans $20 a week for 52 weeks. So I qualified for a few checks, and I gravitated to the local saloon, and I took up the game of shuffleboard, and I was planning a life of petty crime with some of my boyhood companions when I had one of those clear thoughts that come from time to time. I recalled that I had been to college. So I got on a bus and I went up there, and I arrived in the middle of a blizzard, and I walked into this place, and there they were, sitting around a table, drinking beer out of a bottle, singing those songs, wearing those shoes. So I got another pair of shoes, and now a grateful government was sending me a check every month, and I was relatively solvent and therefore moderately drunk all the time. And one day I was staggering around the campus in my usual condition, and I noticed a list of names on the bulletin board of people who were qualified to graduate. And my name was on the list. And this was excellent news. I thought I had another year to go. So I notified the widow of this great event, and she came north, and that was a very tender sight. The widow and her youngest child staggering around under the elms. About 10 years later, I served on the board of that school, and I would go to meetings. They were still talking about my mother. It's not so often in the state of Vermont they see a little old lady get off a train drunk at 9 o'clock in the morning. When I came back home to the neighborhood, the question was what to do with this college degree. And my uncles, who were all Irish and ran the family, had voted unanimously that I become a New York City policeman, because that's what my father had been, my brother had been, and that's what all my uncles and cousins were doing, except for the two morons that worked for the telephone company. But I told them that I was on my way to law school and I'd be unemployed for the next several years, and that was received with mixed emotions. So off I went to law school, and I didn't know anything about law school or lawyers. We didn't have any lawyers in my neighborhood. We had cops and we had priests. We really didn't need any lawyers. I hate to be disloyal to the profession that's made Steve a wealthy man, but I found when I got to law school I was in the company of the greatest collection of stiffs that had ever assembled under one roof. God, they were deadly, and they all had on a blue suit, and they all wore eyeglasses. So I got into uniform, and I got a pair of glasses I really don't think I needed, and I looked for a companion, someone to drink with, but no one drank in this crowd. They were all students. They were all grinding it out. So I became the biggest grind they ever had in that place, and I didn't drink at all. I went on the wagon for law school. And as a result, I did well, and when I came out, I was taken into a large, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant Wall Street law firm, They hired me as sort of the resident immigrant. It was not a total loss, however. I did learn to say, "Oh, really?" instead of "no shit." Restrain yourself, please. My superiors there determined that I should be trained as a trial lawyer, and so I was sent right away to the courthouse in New York City to learn my trade. And I was only there a little while when I discovered that the really bright people were across the street in a saloon. So I moved my office into the saloon, and I learned to drink in a different, more civilized, more genteel fashion. Very few members of the profession were knocking down shots and beers where anybody could see them. So I discovered scotch in a tall glass and ice, and you sip on that, and it gets the job done. I was introduced to all of the mysteries and all of the rituals that surround the very, very dry martini. And to this evening and to this moment, my love, my admiration, and my affection for the very, very dry martini is surely the greatest case of unrequited love the world has ever seen. I was so loyal to those things that they almost destroyed me. Well, after about a year or so of this civilizing influence, it was necessary in my natural development that I be married. And I had located a lady, or she had located me. Who knows how these things work? Ms. O'Keefe, my wife, my current wife, I always call her my current wife. I find it keeps her on her toes. Ms. O'Keefe was from a totally different background than mine. She was raised with a devoted family and a house and a fence and a dog, all that good stuff. And I don't want to burden you with the details of my wedding day, but I assure you that when the O'Keefes from the South Bronx hit the Westchester Country Club, they set a few records. There was only one fight. It was not a particularly good fight. My Uncle Bernie hit a waiter. After that, we settled down and set up housekeeping, and Mrs. O'Keefe then began to produce children in a very boring and monotonous fashion, and with the regularity that is known only to the Roman Catholic. And after a couple of these events, I received a phone call one day from the law school I had attended, the Fordham University School of Law. And I was invited down to see the dean, and the dean appointed me to the faculty, and I became Professor O'Keefe. And I responded to that appointment with great alacrity. And there I was, the boy professor. And I knew that I drank too much. And I really didn't know what there was in my background that justified this kind of an appointment. So I resolved that I would have to drink less. I would have to control my drinking in order to be secure in this position. And I was then, I think, 26 years of age when I thought I'd have to control my drinking. And so I entered into a phase at which I was very unsuccessful of trying to control drinking. It lasted for a few years. But somewhere along the line, within the first 3 years of being a law professor, I discovered that I was able to do that job. I was competent at it. And once I found out I could do the job, then there was no need to not drink the way I wanted to drink. So I went out to drink the way I wanted to drink. I only knew the one way how to drink. My father died when I was 2, and my brother Billy was 4 years older. And Billy was not at all like me. Billy was tall and handsome and good-looking and athletic and all the stuff I wasn't. And Billy was my father and my brother and my hero. And I tried to do everything just like my brother Billy. And I drank just like my brother Billy. I drank until I fell down, or the place went on fire, or the cops arrived, or something would happen to interfere with the drinking. I would see people leaving. I would wonder where the hell they were going. I mean, the whiskey's here, and they're going to make no sense. And in this period of time, too, because I was associated with this law faculty of a large law school, I was appointed to all kinds of things by the governor of the state of New York and the mayor of the city of New York, and I was teaching, and I was affiliated with a law firm, and I was also I even ran for office one time and lost. And I was moving around in what I thought were rarefied political circles. And in the meantime, Ms. O'Keefe and I had it up to about 6 kids, I guess. Who knows? You know, these people, they come and they go. And might have been 6, might have been 7. A lot of kids. I'd see them all the time, and they would run around the house, and there they were, nice little kids, small kids. Nobody you want to talk to or say anything to, but they... And we had a nice house, and we had a couple of cars and belonged to a couple of obscure clubs. And had you asked me in those days how I was doing, I would tell you I was doing very well. As a matter of fact, I would have told you I was doing very well whether you asked me or not. It's one of my favorite themes. Truth of the matter is, at this time, at age 34, I had become a daily drunk. And my day would have killed an ordinary man, a man of lesser talent. I used to come to every morning in that wet bed because the problem with the kidneys had continued unabated all those years. And I would struggle out of my damp sack, and I'd begin my morning aerobics. My aerobics were performed kneeling on the floor of a bathroom with my head in a bowl, and I would have all the water running. The water in the shower, the water in the sink, the water in the tub, because I did not want Ms. O'Keefe and all those little O'Keefes to know that Professor O'Keefe was dying. I would struggle downstairs in my sincere blue suit, carrying over my shoulder, much like Santa Claus, a sack of wet laundry, because Ms. O'Keefe had told me that the diaper service was for the children. And she did not think that a lady of her exquisite breeding ought to do the wash of a 34-year-old bedwetter. If you can imagine a man of my stature in the community starting off each morning with a load of wash. But once I got my wash out of the way, help was at hand. I kept a quart of vodka in the refrigerator. My children call that Daddy's juice. And I would take a few bangs on Daddy's juice, and then the question was, would I throw up in front of all these people? I knew if I lit up a cigarette, it was all over. Sooner or later, I'd arrive in New York City on a train, and I'd go to Grand Central on the train. Grand Central, if you're familiar with it, is not a railroad terminal. It is a collection of saloons that are connected by tunnels. So I would tear around the tunnels like a mole, and I'd pop up here or there and do a repair job. And then I would go up to the law school, and as soon as I got into that imposing institution, my first thought was, how do I get out of here? And I'd get out, I'd tear across town, I'd steal. Every morning I would steal money from a law firm's petty cash, drive several bookkeepers to complete suicide. And then I'd be off and running, and I'd go back to the bar down by the courthouse where it all began. And I would greet my fellow attorneys, and we would discuss manly matters and important things, and we would all get drunk. And they'd buy a drink, and I'd buy a drink, and the bartender would buy a drink, and we'd all have a drink. It was marvelous. And I had it figured out in some peculiar alcoholic way that I was particularly brilliant at 2 o'clock. So my classes were too. And I would go up and shortchange those poor, unwilling sophisticates who had come to sit at my feet and learn law, and I'd run out of there, and I'd go across town to Grand Central to commute. Even though I grew up in the Bronx, I understood the theory of commuting. Commuters are entitled to a drink before they get on the train. So I'd have 10 or 12, and then I would take a train north. It didn't have to go where I lived. North was good enough for me. And I would arrive home somewhere in the course of the evening and bounce off a few walls. and take what was left of Daddy's juice out of the refrigerator and fill up an old cheese glass that some kid had left laying around, and inquire if anybody wanted a martini. But I was the only one that drank in that house in those days. So I'd have a few pops, and then I would eat or not eat, depending on my mood. Evenings I would spend in civic endeavor. Lawyers are very fond of civic endeavor. Civic endeavor by me was cracking up the car, or puking on some hostess's sofa, or playing a little grab-ass with the ladies of Larchmont and a sorrier-looking crop you have never seen. Most nights, however, I would stay home and vegetate, and I would watch television with one eye like this, trying to get those sets to come together. And I would drink, and I would watch television. I would go through the programming and through the news and on into the morning, and then my big moment would come when they played the national anthem. And the Marines would go up Mount Suribachi, and the destroyers would be coming through the water, and they'd be playing that song, and I would cry. Oh, that was so sad. Oh, what a country. I would weep and sob and cry. Then I'd go upstairs and wet their bed. That's it. Another wonderful, fun-filled day. Now, this is not once in a while. This is every day. Weekends, I would say, for binges. And if everybody around me would mind their own business, which was extremely rare, I could get drunk 3 times on Saturday and 3 times on Sunday. Well, as anybody who's ever been married can tell you, while all of this was going on, Mrs. O'Keefe was not entirely silent. From time to time, she would have the temerity to suggest that there was something radically wrong with the way I drank. But I pay no attention to it. Why should I listen? She's my wife. Secondly, she is not an attorney. So what possible value would her opinion be to a person like myself? And because she is fairly dim, I would explain to her the relativity of drinking, which is to say that some people drink more than other people. And based upon a relative study which I had conducted, I was not such a very big drinker. As a matter of fact, I would say to her, I do not drink as much as my mother. And she would say, nobody drinks as my old. Oh. And then she had offended my mother. I would have to leave. And I go see Mom, and we really do a number. Well, this drove her to distraction, and she betook herself to her physician, who, as you might imagine, is an obstetrician. I am one of the few men in Alcoholics Anonymous who came here upon the advice of a gynecologist. And after visiting him, she returned to my house, and she brought me a message from her doctor, the obstetrician. And he had diagnosed me as an alcoholic. Imagine my embarrassment and outrage. And I rose to defend myself, as was my custom. And I launched into one of my addresses, which is also my custom. And the first point I made that evening was a very good point, and still is. I took a very, very dim view of a physician who would diagnose a patient without having ever seen the patient. I was against that shabby type of medical practice all too common in our country today. Then I launched into high gear and I asked Mrs. O'Keefe a question to which she has not yet discovered the answer. I asked her what kind of a man became an obstetrician in the first place, all right? You know, not fooling me. And a large argument ensued, and then it happened. It happened. I don't know how it happened. It happened. It happened. I can't explain how it happened. I can explain many, many other things, and I probably will in the second or third hour of this terrific talk I am giving here. But in the middle of all of this yelling and screaming, I suddenly stopped. And I admitted to Mrs. O'Keefe, for the first time I'd ever admitted to anyone, that there was at least the possibility that I drank too much sometimes. This was a very serious tactical error. 3 days later, I was a prisoner in a mental institution in Stamford, Connecticut. And I'd only been there a matter of moments when I discovered a very serious architectural deficiency in the building. There was no doorknob on my side of the door. And I was overcome with great feelings of outrage and self-pity because in addition to everything else terrible that was going on, it also happened to be the occasion of my 35th birthday. And I mentioned this to a man in a white coat who was passing by, and I very carefully explained to that cretin that on that very day I had attained age 35. And therefore, under the Constitution of the United States of America, I was eligible for the office of president. He urged me not to plan any campaigns. He said there were 2 other presidents in residence. And then he went away and left me. So for the next week or so, I did all those warm, wonderful, happy, and interesting things that alcoholics do when they withdraw from alcohol. I shook, I sweat, I saw things, I heard things. I finally came up for air, and I was then visited by the staff of the hospital, and this was a very fancy rattle box, as befitted a man of my stature, and not one of these childish bullshit 20-day programs they have now. This was the real thing with the barbed wire and everything. And I was visited by the staff, and there were 3 of them. They were all psychiatrists, and I gave 3 completely different stories. And the next day I was summoned into a room not quite as large as this and told that I was in grave danger of being expelled from a mental institution. They said I was not cooperating. And I was cooperating. I was playing Monopoly with 3 guys. They weren't alcoholic, they were just there. And we played Monopoly all day long. And one of them was under the impression that I was his real estate broker. If you know anything of the game of Monopoly and some nut thinks you're his real estate broker, you do pretty well. And I had the boardwalk, I had a few hotels, and I was very happy with the Monopoly therapy and planned on continuing it. And I was then visited. About 2 days later, they came and told me I had a visitor. I wouldn't know what that was. So I went into my large executive-type padded cell and waited for the visitor. And through the door of that room came this very imposing-looking man. And he said he was from the Darien, Connecticut group of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the hospital had given up on me, and they had sent for him to explain to me our program. And of course, I immediately reverted to my origins in the Bronx because I almost had him by the throat, and I called him a few names. And I told him, "You're out of your mind. You take a hike, for Christ's sake, get out of here." And he told me to shut up. Really. Ugh. Well, I intuitively understood that someone had neglected to tell him who I was. So I began to tell him who I was. He told me to sit down and to shut up and to listen to him. Well, he was a very imposing-looking guy, and I was not a well person. And so for the first time in my life, I sat and he began to tell me, as we are instructed in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, what he had been like, how he had come to Alcoholics Anonymous, and what his life was like now. It was a very interesting story. And he said, "Would you like to go with me to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous?" And I said, "Do you mean outside to meetings, sir?" He said, "Outside." I said, "I'm going with you." And besides that, he gave me matches. And no one else had allowed me to have any matches. And this bespoke a certain confidence in me. And that's how it all began. And he took me around and made arrangements for me to go to meetings when I got out. And I got out. And I began to go locally. And I don't recall so much all of that. I was too nervous and too new and to everything. And the hospital had turned me loose with a large jar of those pills they used to hand out to alcoholics. So my head buzzed a lot. But I know myself fairly well. I figured I would come to Alcoholics Anonymous. You would recognize me as a superior person. You would elect me your president. I was always president. If I joined something, I was automatically the president. So you would elect me your president. I would serve a term as your president. And then I would retire. That's the way it seemed to me. Well, I don't have to tell you that it didn't work out. And I lasted 10 months. I lasted from January to October, and then I was drunk again. And this time, of course, I was drunk with a great difference, because I had turned away from the great power of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was to stay drunk for a period of time, and I won't take you through it, because it takes too long, and it still gives me the willies when I think about it. Just let me indicate to you that this was the worst period of my life. Without question, the worst period of my life. I would drink a week, and then I wouldn't drink a month. I'd drink a month, and then I wouldn't drink a week. I would drink and come to these meetings. I would come to these meetings, then I would drink. I never knew when I'd be drinking. I never knew when it would start. I never knew where I'd be when it all ended. And things began to happen to me that had never happened to me before. And I do not speak to you now of things that happened to me in this period of time that I no longer consider to be significant. I do not speak to you now of the fact that I was fired as a tenured professor of law, and that all of the appointments and all of the honors and all of the prestige and all of the dollars that went with that appointment were taken from me in a matter of about 15 minutes. I do not speak to you of the fact that I was in serious, and I mean very serious, personal, professional, and financial difficulties. I do not even speak to you of the fact that I had lost the affection of all those who were around me. All of this happened to me in this period of time, but this is not what I'm talking to you about. What I now understand was happening to me then was that there was, in my case, and perhaps in yours, a terrible, terrible wasting of my spirit. My spirit, this thing that separates me from my cat and separates me even from each of you. That spirit which gives to this particular form whatever individuality or personality or character that it might have. And this was a spirit which once burned in me so bright. And it was extinguished, and I knew it, but there was nothing I could do about it. I had been here, and this did not work for me. And by this time, I'd been everywhere else. I had been through the hospitals and the doctors and the nurses and the drying out places, and I've been through the friends and the money and the politicians. And I've been up and down every avenue there was, and the result was always the same. I was drunk. And it wasn't as though I didn't know about drinking. I knew about drinking. I knew. I had a memory. I remembered the neighborhood. I knew what happened to people who drank the way I did. I knew about my family. I had been to the funerals. I knew. But I kept drinking and drinking. And it was always the same. And truly, truly, as I am before you, truly, I never thought that I'd be able to stop drinking. I just didn't think it was possible. And then one day, my time came. My time came one day. I don't know any more about this than you do. But it seems to me that there is a time for all of us. And it seems to me that there is a time for each of us. I say to you that there is a line somewhere beyond which we are simply not permitted to go. And it seems to me that there is a point somewhere below which we are simply not permitted to sink. And it seems to me that there is a level of pain somewhere beyond which no human is required to endure. I don't know where this line is for you. I only know what happened to me. And this is an individual and a personal thing. And I think it is different in each case. And for some, it may be death. And that's the way it was for my brother Billy. They called one night from the Veterans Hospital in Minneapolis. And the man told me my brother was dead. He had collapsed on the street of Minneapolis. And they had taken him to the vets and he died. And so my brother and my hero died the way alcoholics sometimes do, without friends, without family. And he was a long, long way from our neighborhood. But my brother Billy doesn't drink anymore. And that's how he stopped. And for other people, it can be something fairly trivial. But that line is there. And we all come to it in our own time and in our own way. But come to it we must. And I arrived at a day that wasn't so different from lots of other days. I was 3 or 4 days away from a drink. I was in this place where I worked. I was nervous. I was thirsty. I was thinking about getting a drink. There was a bar in the lobby. Instead of that, I made a call to a longtime friend of mine who's a longtime member of our program. His name is John. He's my sponsor. I told him what was going on with me, and he said he'd be right over, and he was. And he walked into that room, and he looked so good, and I felt so bad. And I asked him what I'd have to do to be as successful as he was in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And John gave me that look that he has. And he said, don't drink. Come to the meetings. You'll be all right. Well, I didn't want him to tell me that. And I told him I didn't want him to tell me. I said, you save that for the dummies you hang out with. I said, John, you really don't understand the problem. The real problem is this place where I work. So a lawyer of my talent should not be in a place like this. Oh, he said, if you don't drink and you go to the meetings, it gets a little better. I said, John, at home it's worse, you know. I hate to go up there anymore. Yeah, he said, well, if you don't drink and you go to the meetings, it might get a little better. I said, I'm being sued by a bank, you know, some misunderstanding about a loan application. I said, well, you know, if you don't drink and you go to meetings, it get a little better. I seemed to understand there was no dialogue there. And so did he, because he said, come on, you're not doing anything. He made a couple of phone calls, and he took me over and he put me on the train up to Larchmont, where I live. It's about a 40-minute ride. About halfway up, I reconsidered. You understand? The hell did I call it? I must have panicked. I call it, don't drink, eh? My ass. I'm going to wait till this train stops. That was my attitude. I got off the train, and standing on the platform of the Larchmont station was my mailman, a guy named Al, who was then chairman of the local AA group. And Al said, get in the car. And I said, get away from me, Al. I don't hang out with mailmen. He said, somebody called me about you. Get in the car. Well, I cannot have a fist fight with a mailman or anybody else. I'd get killed. So I got in Al's car. I said, Al, I'm in bad shape, Al. Well, he said, if you don't drink and come to a meeting tonight, you'll be all right. I knew there was an overall gigantic conspiracy going on. And Al took me up to the group that night. No, I didn't drink. I haven't had a drink since. And that was November the 24th, 1965. So next Saturday, if I live, I'll have 25 years. Thank you. But first I had that day. And I had that day because 2 members of this fellowship were so filled with the gratitude of this fellowship that they took what God sent that day. A drunken, dishonest, arrogant man. Because they were ever so grateful for what had been given to them, they made me the gift of a day. They gave me a day. And I am convinced, because of them and their care and their gift, all of the other days have been possible. And I had a sponsor, and I still do, and I've never been able to be as good a sponsor as my sponsor. He was something. I'd say to him, I don't feel good. Well, he'd say, this may be as good as you'll ever feel. Jesus. Or I'd say, when am I going to get a good job? He said, you had one. Or I would show up and I'd say, I'm very nervous. Yeah, he'd say, well, hang on. I said, well, how do you hang on? He'd say, let go. And he came to me one day, and he had said to me about the first week, he said, you know, based on your obvious intelligence, you're very brilliant, and your educational background, we think that 7 meetings a week ought to do it for you. So I've been hanging around pretty good for 3 or 4 months. I didn't drink. I was going to meetings every night, and I still do. I go to 9 meetings a week now. And he came and he was in one of his lecture modes, you know. I'd gotten to know him pretty good by now. And he said, the trouble with you is that you are ignorant. Now, a lot of people have called me a lot of things in my life. Very few of them said I was ignorant. I said, please, sir, hasten to tell me in what respect you find me ignorant, so that I may comply with your every wish. He said, you are ignorant because you think you came to Alcoholics Anonymous to stop drinking. I said, that had occurred to me, yes. He said, Alcoholics Anonymous has very little to do with drinking. And the reason you will remain ignorant is that you have neglected to read the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And there I had him, because I have one of those minds. I said, oh, so, rarely have we seen anyone fail who was thoroughly followed up. And he gave me that, you know that look that they give you, those old-timers? That look. And he just stared at me and he said, read it again. And I said, yes, John. Because no conversation with that man was ever over until I said, yes, John. And there was no point in, having a discussion, because that was it. He told me to do it. So I began to read again the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And of course, he was right, I hate to say. I did not understand that the book was nothing more or less than a chronicle of the early members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that the book is a synthesization, crystallization of their actual experiences, and that the steps that are contained in the 5th chapter of that book, which Steve read tonight, are steps which have been already experienced. As one of our great pamphlets says, it is a report of action taken. And that these men and women had already done these steps. There were 100 or so men and women who had recovered from a seemingly hopeless condition of mind and body. And to show you precisely how we have recovered is the object of this book. The word recovered is in the big book 57 times. The word recovering does not appear in the big book. An incidental that I will tell. I had no idea when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. I thought that if I said to you my name was Ray O'Keefe and I was an alcoholic, I was doing something about the first step of our program. Well, these men and these women did a great deal more than identify themselves as alcoholics. They admitted that they were powerless over alcohol, that their lives had become unmanageable, and their lives were unmanageable because they were powerless over alcohol. It was all the same thing to them. They were powerless. They had no power. They were without power. The book says that the dilemma of the alcoholic is his lack of power. He has no power. He is powerless. But they didn't drink. And time began to pass for them. Time has passed for me. And for the convention at Santa Barbara. And if you are new, time will pass for you. Time has a wonderful way of passing in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. It passes one day at a time. And somewhere after the succession of days, these men and these women came to believe that there was a power greater than their own. And they believed this. This was part of them. It was vital to them. They believed, brothers, and I believe. As they believe, I believe. And they believed that this power, greater than their own surely, could do for them what they couldn't do for themselves. So firm, so real, so true was that belief. They made a decision. They made up their minds, as once I did. I made up my mind. I'm going to stay here. They made up their mind how they will live. They will live by turning over their will and their life to the care of this power that they had come to believe in. This God as they each understood him. And they were very, very bright. Because at a time in the history of this country when nobody else had this notion, they conceived alcoholism as a disease. Disease that was physical, mental, and spiritual. Disease of the body and of the mind and of the spirit. And when they stopped drinking, they found their bodies responded quickly. And by coming to believe that there was a power here, they enjoyed a mental recovery. It was a little slower than the physical recovery. It was perceptible. They could notice it. And when they made that decision, brothers, they made that decision, that was the key that opened the door. When they offered themselves to God to do with as he would, they asked to be relieved of the bondage of self. They asked that their difficulties be taken away so that evidence of that would give testimony to those they would help of his love and his power and his way of life. And they knew that it wasn't enough to stop drinking and start praying. A lot of people have tried that. It doesn't work. They knew that if they were to be successful, somehow they would have to understand what they were about. And so they wrote a searching and a fearless moral inventory themselves. They sought to determine the exact nature of their wrongs. When they were finished with that, they admitted it to themselves, to the God of their understanding, and to someone else, one of their fellows usually. Great relief to me to go through this process with my sponsor, because I had a mistaken idea of who I was and what I was about. And then they developed an attitude which came hard for me for some reason, because of my ego, I suppose. They were entirely ready to have God remove all their defects of character, and so they went to him with great and compelling logic. They went back to this great power that they had come to believe in and spoke to that power and humbly asked him to take from them everything, the good and the bad, which stood in the way of their being useful to him and to their fellows. And it began to work for them. And it's worked for millions of people since. Who knows how many people have come through this program since 1935? Who knows the extent of the influence that this program has had upon all countless men and women, surely in the millions? It works. It works. If anybody ever had any doubt of that in this area, if you wanted to prove or establish that Alcoholics Anonymous works, all you'd have to do is bring someone into this room at this very minute and sit them right over there and say, look around. It works. It really works. They knew they had not come here alone. They knew that there was in their life, as there was certainly in mine, a great deal of wreckage. And so they wrote a list of everybody they'd involved. Came willing to make amends to them all, and they did. They made amends. Didn't talk about it. They just went out and did it. What Clancy said last night, it was action taken. And you may recall in our book, it describes Dr. Bob's first day, when he began to stop drinking, and he worked that day, and he got home late. And Bill, who was staying at his house, asked him where he'd been. And he said he was driving around Akron, Ohio in his old Buick, mending fences. It's an old Vermont expression. He was making amends the very first day that he came to this program. And I don't think we need wait so long to do all the things that are required of us, especially so when the benefits that we get are so wonderful. When the book says if we are painstaking about this phase of our development, here's the kind of a sponsor I had. I said to him one time, I had about 3 or 4 years, when do I get the promises? He said, are you amazed? I said, no, I'm not amazed. He said, well, shit, you're not even halfway through. Because that's what it says. It says if we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. It says we will know a new freedom and a new happiness. You remember that? We will not regret the past or wish to shut the door upon it. We will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. That feeling of selfishness will slip away. Self-seeking will leave us. We will intuitively understand things that used to baffle us. We will no longer be afraid or have fear of people or of economic insecurity. We will know that God is doing for us all of the things we could not do for ourselves. And I am here to tell you, brothers, these are not extravagant promises. They are being fulfilled among us, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. They will always materialize if we work for them. And by this time, these women and men were sober. And says the book, they had been restored to sanity. And they knew that something very precious had been given to them. And so they resolved to maintain it. And in order to maintain it, they continued to take a personal inventory. They knew they could not enjoy the luxury of a resentment. They knew they couldn't be resentful or hateful. They knew if they were resentful, they would drink, and if they drank, they would surely die. And so, when they were wrong, they promptly admitted that they were wrong. And so great, so real, and so true was this reliance upon a power greater than their own, that they resolved that they would improve their conscious contact with God through prayer and meditation, praying only for knowledge of God's will for them and the power to carry that out. They meditated. They gave thought to their condition. They considered who they were and what they were. And they engage in a very excellent form of meditation. It is a form of meditation in which you are now engaged. They listened. They listened. On the odd chance that this power that they had come to believe in would speak to them. And this power that they had come to believe in did speak to them in their groups, at their meetings. And they prayed, brothers. They prayed. And when they prayed only for knowledge of God's will for them and the power to carry that out. I cannot know how it was with you. But it always seemed to me, from the time I was very, very young, I had a feeling that I did not belong. I knew I was in the wrong family. I did not belong with that bunch. I knew it. I went through those schools and I didn't belong in any. And the odd part about it in my case was I was successful. You know, I was terrific. I was with kids. I was always popular. Terrific in school. Successful in my work. I lived in the right town, in the right house, in the right club, in the right everything. And all my life I felt that I didn't belong. And I suffered from this. And I spent a lifetime on the outside looking in. And then I came here. And I learned to pray this way. And that 12 and 12 says in the last paragraph on the topic of prayer, it says, a great sense of belonging comes to us. We are no longer lost or afraid or purposeless. That despite all of the evidence in the world around us, we understand that the real values of life are truth and justice and love. And we know that a loving God watches over us. And we know that when we turn to Him, all will be well with us here and hereafter. And I can report that that sense of belonging has come to me. It is not so much that you do me the great honor of asking me to speak at this meeting. The plain fact of the matter is, I belong here. I am supposed to be here. It's all right for me to be here. I'm a member. I go to any meeting I want. I belong here. What do you think of that? That's a wonderful feeling. I go all over the country and I belong there. I fit in. It's okay. I love it. Love it. They came upon another prayer and they thought it might help, and we've already prayed that prayer together. And this time they prayed for themselves, but all they asked was peace of mind. So they said to the God of their understanding, grant us the serenity to accept the things we could not change. And they did change. Something happened to these women and men. There was a great change in them. There was a great difference in their attitudes and in their standards. And this great difference, the difference between being drunk and being sober, they termed a spiritual awakening. And they had that spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. And these were the women and the men who at the beginning of this process had admitted that they were hopeless and helpless and powerless. These were the ones who had no power, but having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, they found that they held in their hands and in their hearts and in our program one of the greatest sources of spiritual power that the world has ever seen. They actually had the power to arrest the disease of alcoholism. They had the power to save life. And the only thing they were using was the great power of example of one drunk for another. And armed with that power and having that kind of a spiritual awakening, They began to carry the message to the alcoholic who suffered. And they did that so well that you and I have come together on a night in November of 1990 in the beautiful city of Santa Barbara in the great state of California. And that, my dear, dear brothers, is a long, long way from Akron, Ohio. And they knew. They knew what my sponsor knew. They knew what Clancy talked to us about last night. That drinking has nothing to do with Alcoholics Anonymous. They knew that what had been given to them and to me and to us is an entirely new way of living. And in order to enjoy that new way of life, they said they would practice principles in all their affairs. So where they had been, as I always was, very dishonest, they tried not to be so. Where they were, as I always was, very arrogant, they tried to be less arrogant. Fortunately for us, they said we were not saints. They said it was not a program of spiritual perfection. Said it was a program of spiritual progress. And my sponsor has instructed me, and so I believe that I can progress in the program if I don't drink and go to the meetings. I could keep you here till Tuesday afternoon to tell you of all the wonderful things that have happened to me since I have become a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, but I would not keep you so long. If you have a good wish for me, and I'm sure you do, please be assured that anything you might wish for me has already happened in my life. I won't detail it for you, but just let me tell you, let me put it to you this way. Every single thing, every position, every title, every honor, every dollar that the disease of alcoholism took from me has been returned to me in ways that are so mysterious that I've long since given up trying to figure it out. Every single thing that I lost to alcoholism has been back and in place in my life for a number of years. And one of them that I never did bargain on is perhaps the most important. I bring you the warm and the fraternal greetings of 6 of my children who are members of Alcoholics Anonymous. And one of them is right over there. I would be remiss, of course, if I did not thank you, John, and the committee, and Cheryl and Ralph, and whoever the hell it was that had the good judgment to ask me to come out here. I do a lot of this, and I enjoy it very much. And I'm always delighted to be asked because I say the same thing all the time, you know. It never changes. It's nice to know that I can do it in a nice place such as this. And when I end, and I now do, I always say the same thing. I quote from a pamphlet that is very dear to me, and it was written by a gentleman in Southern California. And I think it's Alcoholics Anonymous' best pamphlet, and I'm very familiar with it. Keep it around, and I read it all the time. It's called A Member's View of Alcoholics Anonymous. And in that pamphlet, at the very, very end, that author takes a biblical turn. And he recalls the time when John the Baptist was once again languishing in one of Herod's prisons. And John sent two of his friends to inquire of his cousin Jesus as to whether or not he was the Messiah. And so these two men found the Lord, and they walked with him. And one day they stopped him and they said to him, "Are you the Messiah? Are you the one that we have been waiting for? Or should we wait for another?" And the Lord never answered that question, but he said to these two men, "Go back to John and tell John only what you have seen and only what you have heard. Tell John that the blind see and the lame walk. And tell John that the deaf can hear and the sick are made well. And tell John that the poor have the gospel brought to them." In my early training, I was told that the word poor in that context could mean poor in spirit. And everyone knows that the word gospel simply means good news. And so, my dear, dear sisters and brothers, here at Santa Barbara, in happy convention assembled, if you will accept a report from me based upon my years in Alcoholics Anonymous, I will tell you only what I have seen and only what I have heard. And based upon that personal observation, it seems to me that the blind do see and the lame do walk. And I know that the deaf can hear. And most certainly, the sick are made well. And I have seen over and over and over again, through the longest day and into the darkest night, the good news of this program brought to the alcoholic who suffers, the poor in spirit. God bless you.